great African mysteries, stories that grip you, make you wonder, yet leave you with an incredulous sense of what's going on. Mysterious true life adventures. An underground journey to discover one of mankind's long-lost relatives. Or discovering the gold hidden by a former president. And a terrible tragedy of an airliner with a deadly cargo. These are truly some of Africa's greatest mysteries. In 2013, the remarkable discovery inside a 3-million-year-old South African cave of an extinct species of archaic human fossils astounded global scientists. The species would come to be known as Homo naledi and would rewrite the history books.
We had found one of the most extraordinary discoveries in the history of the search for human evolution.
The story begins 50 kilometers northwest of Johannesburg, where in an underground cave system near a winding river lies the Rising Star Cave. In these rocky outcrops, some of our earliest ancestors, dating back hundreds of thousands of years, have been discovered.
So essentially, what we're looking at and what we're experiencing at the moment is the birthplace of humankind.
This environment has preserved these remains so very well.
In 2013, Professor Lee Berger had mapped out the Rising Star Cave system using Google Maps. This was to get a better understanding of its various tributaries and, as yet, unexplored areas.
It's got about 3.5 to 4 kilometers of passages and chambers that we have explored. But obviously we are big modern humans. We can't get into all the spaces. We know it's much, much bigger than that. That's in sort of a horizontal direction down to about 30 to 40 meters. But it likely goes for hundreds of meters.
Berger then tasked 2 of his slighter, more athletic male students with exploring and mapping the cave system during their holiday break. It took weeks for the young men to inch their way through the rocks, but it was all worth it when they discovered the remote Dinaledi chamber.
One of the very first things that came up, I'll never forget, was a jawbone, a mandible right here, and had these exquisite, perfect teeth, and yet it looked ancient and primitive, but it was lying right on the floor. No one had ever seen anything like that.
This discovery introduced the world to Homo naledi as another branch of the human family tree.
I found a narrow passage that went down vertically 12 meters through 17.5 centimeter slots into a chamber, and there on the floor were the remains of this ancient human species. We didn't know at the time it would be what it is. I thought it was one skeleton, and within a week we'd found more individual remains than in the entire history of the search for human origins on the continent of Africa.
Almost overnight, this discovery of Homo naledi turned award-winning researcher and paleoanthropologist Professor Lee Berger into the world's most famous fossil finder.
When I first held one of these in my hands, very emotional. I mean, it was an incredible moment when you realize that here was what was almost a unique situation in all of history. I couldn't believe what was happening to us.
Homo naledi is an extinct species of hominin which ate meat, nuts, and plants. Recent further investigation of the caves in which the remains were found revealed scorch marks. So Homo naledi must have known how to make fire.
What we found was a new species of ancient human relative. It was primitive, it had a tiny brain, and it was also skinny, but as you moved distally along its limbs towards its hands, it became more and more human-like.
At 250,000 years old, the species is relatively young. They stood around 146 centimeters high, approximately 4'8", and they walked the earth at the same time as early humans.
This was a small-brained hominin that had very human-like hands and feet that was living on the landscape at the same time as our own species.
The discovery of Homo naledi confirms what paleontologists and zoologists have long suspected, that multiple hominin species evolved in parallel and coexisted, sometimes side by side. By 2018, Professor Lee Berger and the scientific community had many more questions about Homo naledi, which could only be answered by exploring the cave system further. But there was a major problem. Professor Lee Berger himself couldn't fit through the small passages and tunnels, and so he needed to find archaeologists who were also experienced cavers who could.
And so I put a call out on Facebook for skinny cavers that would be willing to risk their lives and do something extraordinary. So I picked 6 extraordinary scientists who just happened to be women.
Nilwen Molapiani answered the call to become part of Lee Berger's coveted team.
Well, the first time I actually just went into this cave system, I was not ready for it. I did not know what I was getting myself into. And there really is no way to prepare anyone for it. It was terrifying, but also knowing that if you slip and you fall, you have 2 options. You either fall to the right and hit a whole bunch of rocks, or fall to the left and fall into the nothingness, absolute blackness. It's literally just a slit in the rock, and you have to go down and try not to impale yourself and squeeze through that 17 centimeter space somehow, try not to get stuck.
And then it gets hard. Then you look down what we call the chute entrance. And that actually is a narrow passage about that wide that drops down through a series of turns and passages that will eventually take you to the hill antechamber 12 meters below. But in that, you have to do 5 or 6 incredibly hard squeezes. And some as narrow as 17.5 centimeters before dropping into this chamber. And there, you see one of the most incredible things humans have ever seen. A place where another species of non-human animal, but related to us in some way, disposed of its dead.
Until this moment in history, we thought that the idea of ritualized behaviors directed towards the dead, things like burial or secreting your dead into deep chambers, was utterly unique to Homo sapiens. We have now seen, we believe, a species that had that same capacity. And that is an extraordinary thing.
But Professor Berger still had a challenge. While his discovery was making international headlines, he'd never been into the actual cave and seen it with his own eyes. He just couldn't fit. He had to bear the frustration of directing his team without actually experiencing the thrill of discovery firsthand.
We had remote cameras, and everything was like looking at grainy NASA pictures because it was so remote and just so hard to get to. And the chute labyrinth area was too small for me. And so I resigned myself to that, sitting watching this tiny number of extraordinary explorers get into this incredibly difficult and dangerous space through, camera lenses and remote observations.
It is said that there have been more people on the moon than there have been in the Dina Lady Chamber or in the Rising Star Cave system doing actual archaeological and paleoanthropological work.
Several months ago, I decided that, as I get to a certain age, that I may not have many opportunities if I'm ever going to make this trip. And there were so many questions that needed answering by an experienced, broad scientist down in there. And I was working on these questions, and I decided to make that attempt. There was no part of that journey that was not extraordinarily difficult. And getting down that 12 meters in 15 or so minutes, which is incredibly painful, climbing 12 meters through, pulling yourself with your upper body through these spaces where your chest is compressed and you can't look down or up because there's not enough space for you to turn your head and your helmet. Just been in Dragon's Back and am looking around this area, and I just wanted to give you an idea of these spaces. Sometimes we don't take the time to show all of you, what the spaces and the journey actually looks like. So we come down from up there, and you can see the narrow slot there. That's probably, it's less. There's spaces in there that probably about 8 or 9 inches is the greatest squeeze on there. Most people can get through that fairly easily.
And then we head down in that direction, and Superman's Kraal is just at the end, about where my finger shadow is right now, down in that direction where we get on our hands and knees and pass through Dragon's Back.
Since the first expedition in 2013 and the second in 2018, the team have brought nearly 2,000 fossils to the surface. But he was convinced there was more. Then in November 2021, Professor Berger's team made a further astonishing discovery. Deep in the narrowest of crawl spaces, his team found parts of the skull and teeth of a 4-year-old child.
A tiny Homo naledi baby skull. We're proud to bring you this discovery that we've named Ledi.
Ledi was found 12 meters beyond the Dinaledi chamber, where the initial Homo naledi remains were found. The incredible find of a hominin child's skull is extremely valuable, as juvenile prehistoric remains tend to be very delicate and extremely fragile.
It gives us new questions, and it gives us new answers, and it gives us just new hope in our endeavor to understand who we are and where we come from and why we're here. That's the mystery of the cradle. It's a mystery that keeps on giving.
To live in a time when a previously unknown species of extinct hominin is discovered in our own backyard is a privilege. We can only hope that the mystery of Homo naledi will be solved in our lifetimes, so we might get answers to the great question of how we evolved into what we are today, and why only Homo sapiens survived.
I think it would be fair to say that Homo naledi is right now one of the greatest mysteries that ever faced us as a species looking at our own past. It doesn't fit the way we were telling the story of human evolution. It has a small brain later in time, and we thought it was an inevitable march to a large brain. It shouldn't exist in this time and place where we thought there were only Homo sapiens in Africa. It tells us we got the story wrong.
Tales of hidden treasure are always enthralling, and the legend of the Kruger Millions is a mystery that simply refuses to die.
The Kruger Millions, myth or fact? What a wonderful story.
The mystery of South Africa's Kruger Gold Millions has continued to intrigue treasure hunters for more than a century. While the occasional Kruger pound has allegedly been found, many die-hard treasure hunters are still scouring the area around the Blyde River in the old eastern Transvaal. Many believe that's where President Paul Kruger must have stashed the millions before making his way to Europe.
The myth itself that it's buried somewhere, or that it is hidden somewhere, and that it can be found, and that whoever finds it will be tremendously rich. This only originated some years after the war, when people started questioning what had happened to all the money. So people started looking for it. Where is it? Who did what with it?
This legend goes back to the year 1900 and the Second Anglo-Boer War, now known as the South African War, between the British and the Boer republics of South Africa. The war was over the British influence in southern Africa, spearheaded by Lord Earl Roberts, but at the heart of the conflict was the battle for control of the world's richest gold deposits, the Witwatersrand goldfields and the diamonds in the Orange Free State. Paul Kruger was a very popular president. He'd already served 4 terms, but this was an extremely tense time.
He lived in Church Street. And that specific house that is now the museum was where he lived with his wife Christina from about 1885-86.
The house also accommodated some of his 15 children. It had a long veranda which overlooked one of the dusty main roads. He'd sit on the stoep in the warm, early Pretoria mornings and talk to everyone who passed by.
Everyone in town, even strangers actually, knew that they were welcome to come and have coffee with him. He was a man of the people. His people loved him and they trusted him to be wise.
Pretoria was pretty built up at that time, thanks to the gold rush. There were many shops and South African government buildings around Church Square.
There would have been some big buildings on the square already. The main office of the post office would be here. There were some businesses operating already. The government architect at the time, he was a Dutchman, and he's famous for some of his buildings, like the Palace of Justice. It was a lively little town and a very cosmopolitan population as well, because people came to try and find gold, and when they didn't find it, they moved into town and started businesses or started working here.
This was also where the financial district and the government mint was based, and it was here that the gold bullion and coins which would make up the Kruger millions was said to have originated. Overlooking one entire side of Church Square, the old Ratsal or council chambers is considered to be the chief architectural wonder of Pretoria. The foundation stone was laid by Paul Kruger in 1889. Die Ratsal was home to the Parliament of the South African Republic from 1891 to 1902. It would have been a short carriage ride from Kruger's home a few blocks away.
At the moment we are sitting in his office at the Ratsal, where he would have spent most of his days from 10 o'clock onwards. This is the front office, the one closest to the entrance. He wanted to be the one to talk to people walking in from the street and be accessible to all of them.
Here in his Ratsal office, he would be regularly updated on the movements of British forces. In the early days, the Boers still had the upper hand, as there was only a small army of British soldiers in the country. But there was enough to cause concern and to give President Kruger sleepless nights.
So he had a telegram machine installed in Kruger House itself, and the telegram operator used to sleep on one of the couches in the sitting room there, so that he was available if there was any news from the front. Kruger was the first to hear it.
In May 1900, the war had progressed to just outside Pretoria. The Transvaal government decided, as a precaution, to move the seat of power from Pretoria and create a temporary capital in Machadodorp, a town a few hundred kilometers away in the old Eastern Transvaal. Before he left Pretoria, President Kruger instructed that all the gold in the mint be removed, allegedly £2 million worth then, worth over £300 million today. The money was to be used to fund the Boer armies in the continuing war. He also didn't want the gold to fall into the hands of the British.
And everybody knew, look, what's going there? And they heard, that's the gold. There go the Kruger millions.
There was actually millions of Kruger pounds, or at least worth millions of pounds, and also bullion, gold bullion, in the form of gold bars, that was moved out of Pretoria.
They knew that the English were already in Johannesburg, so within days, Pretoria would be handed over. And they didn't want that money to fall into the enemy's hands. It was taken then to the station, put on a train, and the Auditor General himself went with them, and it was fully under guard.
President Paul Kruger, fearing for his own safety, said goodbye to his wife Gesine and slipped away on the night of May the 31st, 1900. He left her in Pretoria as she was too ill to travel.
He left at night, in secret.
He never saw her again, as she died in July of the following year. He left State Attorney Jan Smuts in charge.
President Kruger and the Transvaal government left along the Eastern Railway line and they went to Machadodorp, which was to be the capital for the next month or two. And after that, the Transvaal government was in the field for the rest of the war.
Machadodorp is 215 kilometers away from Pretoria. It's a small town with the Elands River running through it. A new government was formed and their offices were the railway carriages that they travelled in.
And that specific carriage was his home for all the time that he spent traveling with the government.
Back in Pretoria, early on the morning of the 4th of June 1900, a shock awaited the accountant who worked at the government.
The accountant of the Mint on Church Square arrived there at 7 o'clock on the Monday morning, the 4th of June 1900, with Lord Roberts and the forces approaching from the south, and he discovered that there was still some gold bullion and gold coins in the mint. And Smart said, "Good heavens, I thought it had been removed." In the meantime, everybody there in the mint was actively working, weighing the gold, making an inventory, and packing them in wooden crates. By 12 o'clock, noon, the money was ready and the gold was ready to be loaded onto these two trolleys. And of course, with these 6 or 8 policemen with their rifles going up on horseback to the station,
The gold coins and 134 gold bars were taken from the mule carts and put on a train on the Delagoa line towards the Eastern Transvaal. It was en route to the new temporary seat of government in Machadodorp, where Paul Kruger was now living.
and all of a sudden creditors started to arrive from Pretoria, from all over, who had supplied the Transvaal government with ammunition, with horse saddles, with horseshoes and clothes and boots and tents. They were claiming their money, and it was paid out in gold and in bluebacks, paper money, to these guys.
Meanwhile, in Pretoria, the residents were scared and unsure about what was happening. Their government had run away and was remaining silent, and the invading British troops were heading for the capital.
Things were pretty tense in town, I think. You can imagine that people knew that Lord Roberts had arrived in Cape Town with a large army of reinforcements. And he was marching with that army towards Pretoria because everybody knew it was the capital of the South African Republic. And if it fell, the war would be over.
When the war officially ended in May 1902, by which time President Kruger was in Europe, the mystery of the missing Kruger millions exploded. Everyone knew that Kruger had run the government from Machadodorp for 4 months, and this was the last time the gold had been seen.
One of the favorite places is the railway tunnel between Waterval Bo and Waterval Onder, through which the train that carried that treasure passed. So it would have been very easy to stop the train in the middle of the tunnel, dig a hole, put the treasure into this hole and proceed on the journey. And that's it.
And the rumor came that the gold was buried somewhere in the mountains in the Eastern Transvaal.
When Paul Kruger left Machadodorp, he travelled by train to the port of Lorenzo Marques, now Maputo, and sailed to Marseille in France. He eventually settled in Clarens, Switzerland, where he died in July 1904, taking the secret of the missing millions with him.
People are always positive. They want to see the positive in everything, and therefore they want to change their dull life into something splendid, with lots of glitter and money, and I'm going to be rich. And this is what makes treasure seekers do what they do.
Treasure hunters continue to believe that the most likely location of the Kruger millions lies somewhere between Machadodorp and the Mozambican border. Others say Kruger took the millions with him when he fled to Switzerland and stashed it in a bank there, where it remains to this very day. Sadly, there are some who also claim the funds were simply exhausted by the demands of the Boer War.
A war is an expensive thing, so I don't think that there's much left. What I do think is that there were many people, when they heard that the English were coming, that would bury their own valuables in their farmyards or in their cattle kraals or whatever. And probably if somebody found a Kruger coin somewhere, it's probably those that they found.
All these stories tell us there is gold available.
Could you be the one to find the elusive treasure and become rich beyond your wildest dreams? Or will the mystery of the Kruger millions live on?